Will you pray with me, please, just for a moment? Pause for silence. Holy One, in the midst of the everyday, the way we live our lives, the way the world moves around us, in this moment, still our hearts, open our minds and our eyes and our perception, and open mine as I attempt to be present to you in this place. Amen. So a couple of weeks ago, I told the story about my uncle taking me out during spring break. It was one of those spring breaks where friends had gone off skiing. I was stuck at home. Family couldn't afford the ski trip. Uncle Mac, the crazy guy that he is, the trickster that he is, out of nowhere, all alone, single man, bursts into the house. My friends have gone off. I'm moping in the living room. It's nighttime. He's got a JanSport empty frame backpack, and he says, "We're going mountain climbing." And I'm thinking we're in Fort Worth, and where are there mountains? And as I mentioned in the story, we went out to West Texas, and on that first trip out there, in the middle of the night, we're driving out there, and he shuts down the lights as we're out on the interstate, and it's pitch black, and I'm screaming, and the stars suddenly appear, and he's saying, "Look at what the stars are. Just look at the stars." And I suddenly realized we've moved from one reality, and now we're in the midst of another reality, but sometimes it takes that kind of jolt to get us out. Then the next morning, we end up at the Last Chance Gas and Food Cafe, which is out there not too far from Salt Flats, West Texas, if you've ever been out towards Guadalupe Mountains. And it's literally the last chance for food or gas, and sometimes they happen together. And it's just one of those strange places where you meet people from everywhere. You were thinking it. I went there. You were thinking it anyway. But it was a great place, and of course, my uncle made the joke, said they got the best biscuits and gravy anywhere, and of course, it was obvious because there's nowhere else around, so they had that. And Uncle Mac was just always full of stories and always full of ways of looking around at the people that you don't normally associate with, and then somehow making them close to home, somehow making you feel like you're a part of something much bigger. And of course, as a teenager, none of that made sense to me. I just was experiencing my weird uncle. Next morning, though, I wanted to pick up the story briefly and tell you what happened, because I never finished it. We left the last cafe, last food and gas cafe that morning, and the last thing that I left you with was that the waitress there had said, my uncle had told her to have a great day, and the waitress said, "That's the only kind of days we make around here," and we headed out towards the Guadalupe Mountains. So that next morning, as we're driving, the one thing I started noticing when there's not much to look at is you start making things up, right? I mean, just looking out at whatever tumbleweeds there are, and you can only see so many of those. There's not a lot of them out there, and the rest of it's brown and flat. Don't know if you've ever driven that far out West Texas, heading out towards Guadalupe and then beyond towards El Paso. But the mountains were a long ways off in the distance. But even at 70 miles, you could begin to start seeing something. You could start seeing a little bit of a rise, a little bit of a shadow. But what you start seeing on the road is you start seeing these puddles, these little water spots. And every now and then I would say, "Uncle Mac, did it rain?" Of course, the sun was brilliant, and he'd say, "No, it didn't rain." And I'd keep saying, "Well, what is this water?" And then you get on top of it. You realize it wasn't water. It's just a mirage. You just see that reflection of what you think's there. And after a while, my uncle got to where he just suspected it. So even while it was silent, he'd just look over at me and go, "It's not a mirage." I didn't even get to say anything. And the great surprise was that eventually, as we got closer towards the mountain, I saw this, but I wasn't going to say anything, but there it was, reflecting in the road, and then we went right over it, splash, and then he kind of smiled, and he said, "Sometimes they're not." And that's kind of the way it always was with him. And as we got closer to the mountains, I would see the trees up there. And then back as far as they were, I'd think they're bushes. And then I'd see something on the side of the mountain that looked kind of like a log or something. But even at a distance, you're not sure if it's stationary or not. And sure enough, my uncle would look over and he'd say, "It's not a bear." I know what you're thinking. It's not a bear. So we pulled around the front of El Capitan, which is a mountain that sticks out kind of like a train engine all the way up to the edge of the road. And as we turned around it, we went into the parking lot. And the ranger that was there said, "Well, you fellas, what are you here for?" And I, of course, wanted to make a joke. "Well, we're here to do some mountain skiing." And my uncle just interrupts me and says, "We're going to do some hiking." He says, "Well, it's a good time to be here because there's nobody here. It's the middle of the week. They won't be back in here till the weekend, last of spring break. You're going to be all by yourselves, most likely." And my uncle's like, "That's wonderful." And as we're grabbing up our little pass, our little pass to let folks know and put it in the car that we're there, he stops us and he says, "Watch out for snakes and bears." And I look at my uncle and he smiles and says, "Nothing to worry about." And so we start on the trail. And it's about a 4-hour hike, and I'm carrying, I packed pretty quickly, and I'm carrying only essentials, like 4 or 5 cans of my favorite beans and soup, and then I brought a radio, one of those large portable radios, and 5 or 6 extra batteries, because that's important. And I brought my own tent because I knew Uncle Mac snored. And then I had my tent poles, and basically I had overpacked, and about halfway up the trip I was exhausted. And Uncle Mac had underpacked intentionally, and he took on some of the load, and we continued. We got to the top of the mountain, and we were almost blown off. It was hot out there in March sun, but as we got to the top of the mountain, we're at about almost 8,200 feet. And the wind just almost knocked us off the edge. And Uncle Mac, of course, he was laughing and hollering, "Woo!" And he was getting out these coyote sounds as he starts to tumble backwards. And I kind of grabbed my pack, and we go down into a little bit of a draw, and we set up a tent. My uncle, as we were setting up the tent, I was going to go set up my tent, and my uncle said, "So what'd you think about that bear thing you mentioned?" And I said, "Well, are there bears out here?" And he said, "Well, Tommy, we're out in the mountains. We're in the woods. Of course there's bears." And I said, "But bears like right around here?" And he said, "Well, I don't see any, but yeah, there's probably bears." I said, "Well, how are we going to know if we're going to have problems with bears?" And he said, "Well, if you're going to have a problem with a bear's going to let you know first." And I said, "Well, how are we going to know if there's a bear around?" They said, "Well, he'll let you know." That's what my uncle said. So we did some hiking around, and I stayed close, but I decided that night just to go ahead and stay in the same tent as my uncle. Hiking around, my uncle said something to me, because I kept on, I'm 13 years old, and we're out there, and I kept hollering about this or that, or I'd hear something, and my uncle said, "Would you just be quiet? Because you're missing everything." And I said, "What do you mean I'm missing stuff?" He says, "You're missing what's around you." And I said, "I'm looking for bear." And he said, when you're looking for what you're afraid of, you're not seeing what's right here. And so I just got quiet. And it took me an hour to suddenly realize that I was in the midst of these amazing woods. And my uncle was one of these people who would always, he'd always say it was his Native American, tactics. He would practice being silent so that you could be one with nature. And I always laughed because of that sort of stereotypical image that he'd create. But the reality is that once you got quiet, you really were kind of one with something much larger. That night we got in the tent, and it snowed, and the wind whipped around, and it was totally unexpected. The temperature dropped about 20 degrees, and I had fallen asleep in the midst of all that noise and chaos. Next morning when I woke up, the tent, Uncle Mac wasn't in his sleeping bag. The flap was flapping around. There was about 1.5 feet of snow on the ground. There was snow on the top of the tent. And I was looking for Uncle Mac, and then I heard him holler, and he said something like, he always made up his own kind of cuss words, and he said, "Possum snot." And I'm like, and I said, "What?" And he said, "Bear got our food." And I said, "Bear?" And I looked out, and sure enough, there was torn nylon, and he had hung a bag up during the night of food. I didn't know why he had done that. I always thought that was kind of strange. But he said it was to keep it out of range of a bear. And I said, "Well, why did the bear get it then?" He said, "Well, because I didn't hang it enough out of range." And I said, "Well, is he coming back?" And he said, "I don't think so. Looks like he got what he came for." Then he smiled and he said, "But that's all our food, so we got to go back down." So we packed up, and we weren't prepared for cold weather. And we got back down and got the pack and went back down the mountain. And at first, I was thinking, as I looked back, the first thought that occurred to me as I remembered back this story is, why did it never occur to me to be upset that we had wasted time? To be upset that we had wasted all this time to go out there and then come back and realize, we didn't get to experience much of a trip at all. That never occurred to me once. In retrospect, I know why. It's because of my uncle. That's just who he was. Every moment was the moment you were in. And that's what you worked on. That's what you were present to. So when we were driving back, even though we were only there for the night, the one night as we're driving back, I started asking questions like I would always do around him. And I said, so what is the difference between mountain time and central time? Because I hardly got to experience it. He said, well, mountain time, you're an hour ahead, and in central time, you're an hour behind. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. He said, well, right now, if it's 10 in the morning in mountain time, then it's 11 in central time. So you lose an hour when you go back across. Unless you were coming this way, you gained an hour. And I said, so we gained an hour, but now we're getting it back, or we're losing it. And then it just got confusing to me. And I said, Uncle Mac, what if you lived right in the middle, right on the line between central and mountain time? And he looked at me and he said, you know, Tommy, there's a town in Arizona called Tuba City, and they have 2 time zones on either side of the street. And they say there's a fella who can't figure out if he's coming or going when he goes back and forth. He's either late or he's early, but he never knows which way. I mean, that's what my uncle would do. He would just, it's true though, there really is a city, Tuba City, and they really do have 2 time zones. But it took someone like my uncle to realize that and to be able to share that. One of the things that I look back and think about my uncle that I want to share with you is and I don't think he knew this. As I look back at my uncle, I often portray him as being sort of one of these wise fools, one of these sort of tricksters, one of these crazy wisdom kind of characters. He was crazy and he was wise, but I don't think he ever intended for the two to come together the way they did. I think they just did, because he lived genuinely out of his desire to sort of be present to people. And more than that, though, I think it was his desire to be curious. If things were obscure to him, if things were confusing to him, if things were even a little bit frightening to him, he seemed to be the kind of person that would simply embrace it and try to figure out what it was about himself that he didn't know yet. So I want to think with you about this idea of what it means to embrace trepidation. You might have seen the bumper sticker, one of my favorite, that says Eschew Obfuscation. Anybody in here go to their phones when they came in early on just to see what that was? You? Yeah? Eschew Obfuscation. Avoid confusing. Avoid confusion. Avoid confusing matters or making matters more confusing. But embrace trepidation. In our world, there's a lot of fear. In our world, there's a lot of bad things that happen, and it seems like a lot of the bad patterns that are part of human nature never really seem to cure themselves, never really seem to rectify. In reality, over a long period of time, some of them do change. But even the church falls prey to our human nature, to our basic fears, to our basic inability to get beyond ourselves. And for generations and generations, the church has had its hand in oppressive lifestyles and oppressive realities. And it's a challenge for us, regardless if we're inside or outside the church. This first text that Mary Beth read was that this idea of Jesus the Good Shepherd, I am the Good Shepherd. It's a familiar text for a lot of people. But as I was reading it, I was thinking to myself what that means. And we often think in terms of this dualistic kind of thing that we've talked about so much in here, this idea that God from outside us came and basically saved us from ourselves. When in reality, there's another aspect to shepherd that I think we miss, which is this intimacy, this relationship that happens between sheep and shepherd. And when we start thinking about the response of the disciples that he was speaking to in this text, there's this wonderful phrase where he says, I have other sheep, and they're a part of the fold too. It's as if this text, and it's written by the author of the Gospel of John, and as we've talked in the past, that gospel is a very mystical gospel. It's written many years after the other gospel. It's written in a completely different context. Its language is completely different from the other gospels. It speaks to a very mystical kind of experience. And if we look at that text, we realize that part, at least, of what might be being said here is this idea that human nature is too limiting. And it's something that we fight all the time. It's something we struggle with. Our fears, our anxieties. Who do we include? Who do we exclude? Who's our enemy? Who's not our enemy? And what I think this text is reminding the early readers and today, or the early listeners and today for us, is this idea that the pen is a lot bigger than we think it is. The pen is a lot bigger. The sheep pen, if you will, is a lot bigger than sometimes we might even be comfortable with. There was a book that I read back in the 60s. Some of you might have read it too. It was a book by a guy named J.B. Phillips. It was called Your God is Too Small. And the thing was challenging. The book was transforming for its day. We've talked about the Copernican revolution and how that changed the way in which people saw themselves in relation to the solar system. We're no longer the center of the solar system. The sun is. And as Copernicus said, it revolves around the sun. And the other planets revolve around the sun. And the moon revolves around. We're no longer the center. And then the second Copernican revolution, when Darwin wrote the Origin of the Species, we're no longer what we thought we were in relation to this sort of magical, mythical understanding of how God created us, distinctive, special, unique. We are unique, we are special, as everything else in creation is, but we're a part of something bigger. It's not so much we are created to dominate everything else, we're a part of everything else. Somewhere around the turn of the century, just prior to that, just after the Age of Enlightenment, but somewhere in the early period of the 1900s into the mid-1900s, this idea that maybe how we think about God is too small already began germinating, already began to ferment in our thinking. And so even today, it becomes more and more of an issue and of a struggle as we try to understand who we are in relation to the divine and who the divine is, who God is in relation to us. And I want to suggest that as we look back and as we look at our own insights and our own understandings, that maybe we need to challenge our fears, that maybe we need to open up. Now, I bring up some of this because right now it's an issue within the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church struggling with exactly its language and the church discipline. In fact, this afternoon, a number of us clergy and delegates to the conference, the annual conference, are meeting as a part of a big discussion, a holy conversation it's called. We're calling it. And of course, it revolves around the language of whether or not the church should allow gay marriage, whether or not the church should be inclusive of everyone for ordination. It's a struggle that the church has had for many years, and other denominations that you've read about have been struggling through this and have come to different terms, obviously. And I think it's one that we need to come to terms with, but it's not that simple, I realize. There's a lot of different issues that go into this. But I think more than anything, there's a lot of fear. And that's the challenge, how to address the fear. How to get back past the fear so that we might recognize God's creation in one another in all of its facets. I'm curious how the discussion will go this afternoon. But it raises for me this issue of how big is the pen? How big was it intended to be when Jesus said these words? And it's simply not that issue. It's not simply the human sexuality issue. It's every issue we find ourselves in when we have chosen to see ourselves against someone else. When we have chosen to see that there are certain ethnic groups who for some reason keep falling prey to the same kinds of oppressive behaviors. Whether it's with law enforcement or whether it's with an issue across the world. We still have this tendency as human beings to set ourselves apart from others because I believe of our fears first. And getting past those fears can be very difficult. So the second thing I want to suggest to you is how we can maybe start to do that. And I'm just going to throw it out there kind of quickly. But we might, hopefully we can get a chance to think about this some more next week as well. I wanted to kind of split this between 2 Sundays because I think it's important. And what I want to get across to you is this idea that I think my uncle was always doing with me without me realizing it. And without him realizing it too. It's this idea of little mind versus big mind. Now, the concept is actually a Zen concept, but I think it's also very much of a mystical concept in the Christian tradition. I think it's very much a concept at the heart of this text. I think it's very much a concept at the heart of the prayer that we prayed in Psalm 23. Our tendency is to separate ourselves from things because fear creates this anxiety of how things happen to us, why things happen to us, how do we get things fixed. And so we see things in relation to our specific needs or our anxieties. And then we associate with certain groups who can identify that with as well. Bring some sense of comfort to us. But the reality is that we're all part of a bigger picture. So big mind and little mind is actually an idea that comes from Suzuki, D.T. Suzuki, who came over to the United States in the 50s and then brought his ideas of Buddhism over here. But I want to think with you in terms of just sort of a general way of thinking about little mind and big mind. We all know little mind. It's the most obvious. Little mind is when we get obsessed with our problems for the day. Little mind is when I go to sleep at night, and maybe you do this as well, and you can't get your mind off of one thing. And you spiral and spiral, and you just can't get to sleep. Or if you do, you might take a little sleep aid, or if you might distract yourself. Little mind is a normal behavior. It's a normal experience. It's the reality when I get caught up with a problem, and the only way sometimes to get away from that problem is to go distract myself. Maybe I go to the beach. Maybe I go into the mountains, and I feel comforted. Maybe I come listen to my favorite music, and it comforts me. Little mind is caught up in my immediate needs and the ways in which I address those needs. Big mind is this idea that when I go to the beach and I experience all of the wonder and grandeur, I haven't lost the reality of what's going on in my life. It's suddenly just assumed in all of it. I just simply realize in the midst of all of my own problems, I live in the midst of a wonderful and abundant creation. So I'll give you an idea, a little example. I want you to close your eyes for a second. Just close your eyes. We'll do this very quickly, but I want you to imagine that you're very close to a spider. Okay, now some of you are already feeling anxious. Just let that go for a minute. You're looking at a spider. It has hairy legs. It's got the strange, grotesque kind of mandibles. I'm sorry. Feel for a moment the anxiety if you feel that, or just simply the wonder if you feel that as you're looking at the spider. Now move back just a little bit in your imagination and see the spider and the leaf that it's standing on. And you move back a little bit further and you see that the leaf is part of a bush that's holding both the spider and the web that it sits on. And that the web is reflecting the morning sun. And you move back a few more feet and you realize that you're looking at a field that contains the bush and the spider web and the spider at the heart of that web and the birds that are flying around. And just try to be present with that for a moment that you can actually feel what that feels like. Suddenly, you're caught up in how wonderful creation is. And you move back a little further and you see the field is part of a hilltop. And beyond the field, there might be an ocean or a beach or a forest. And you can open your eyes. Now, it's a simple and an obvious exercise, but the reality is that that's a part of who we are all the time. Our tendency is to get caught up in the small. We operate out of this immediacy of the small and forget about how large creation is, how much a part of all of this that we are, and that we miss. Little mind gets jerked around by the content of its experiences. Big mind is concerned with the context of your life more than the content of your life. Big mind sees the trees and the forest and the hills and the mountains all around them and the spider stinging the cricket in the midst of its web. It sees the butterflies. It sees the meadow. Big mind sees the problems of the world and sees the world in the context of creation. What my uncle did with me, I think, without realizing it, was that my uncle was trying to get me out of my little mind. Sometimes the only way to get out of little mind is to get out of your little space, is to remind yourself that you're part of something so much larger. I wish that when we were having our discussion this afternoon in a church, in a room, in chairs around tables, that we could simply leave and go out and sit in the midst of creation and realize how small sometimes our problems are, how finite sometimes our fears are in the grandeur of creation. And that when we play our little games that center around our fears, we're missing our role in creation, I think. I wish we could do that, but we won't be able to. Maybe I'll have an opportunity and I'll stand up and I'll say, let's all close our eyes for a moment. Let's imagine a spider. Maybe we'll do that. I don't know. I'm getting older now and I'm caring less about the consequences. But I think it's important. I think it's an important thing that we face as we look at life's problems. Well, I want to finish with this one quote, because we've run out of time here. And as usual, I have way too much to talk about. So we'll split it up and I'll talk some more about big mind and little mind. There are some wonderful ways of how to cultivate it. But one thing I want to leave you with is just something we're celebrating this weekend. Maybe not all of you. I wish you would join me. Maybe you don't remember this, but 25 years ago, around this time, around this weekend, was when the Hubble telescope was launched off into space. And over the last couple of years, I've been just marveling at the kinds of pictures that come back. And I came across this quote last week when I was thinking about this message. And it was what Carl Sagan had written from the first pictures that came back. Just want to read this as our closing quote. From this distant vantage point, the Earth might not seem of any particular interest, but for us, it's different. Consider again the dot. The picture that came back showed the solar system and the tiny dot that was our blue planet in the midst of that solar system, just one of the earliest pictures that had come back. Consider that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you've heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives, the aggregate of our joy and suffering, all of the religions, ideologies, economic doctrines, every hunter, every forager, hero, and coward, every explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, supreme leader, every saint and sinner lived here on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The earth is a small stage. Think of all of the rivers of blood spilled by all of the people in our history so that in glory and triumph they could become a momentary master of a tiny, tiny fraction of a tiny dot. Think of the endless cruelties and the endless oppressiveness that has been imposed upon people on this tiny speck. The earth is the only world known so far to harbor life for now. Like it or not, for the moment, it's where we make our home. It has been said that astronomy is the humbling character-building exercise. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceit than this distant image of our tiny world. When I think of big mind and little mind, when I think of the shepherd and I think of the sheep, I think of this idea of God preparing a table in the midst of our adversity. I keep coming back to this one idea. It's not me and my enemies. It's not me and my adversity. It's in the midst of my life and my adversity. The feast is always present. It is always prepared. The thing I have to get past is that it's not my feast. It's our feast. Amen.